Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For anyone who's meeting us and Jack Pine Press for the first time, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about us. So Jack Pine Press is based way out here in Saskatoon. We were founded in 2002, and for almost 20 years, we've helped poets and artists make weird, beautiful, handmade poetry chapbooks. We encourage collaboration and the sharing and learning of new skills, the intersection of artistic disciplines, and the exploration of what a book is permitted to be. Jack Pine Press receives support to do what we do from Sask Arts, and we'd like to extend our sincerest thanks to them tonight for making it possible for us to bring you this wonderful poetry and these beautiful books.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for tonight's launch of Your Very Own by John Nyman. This is our very first hybrid launch event, so I expect that we will learn a lot during tonight, and we will also have loads and loads of fun. I'm Taya Gerbeza. I'm a Jack Pine board member, and I am so excited for tonight and to be your host. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm broadcasting from and that Jack Pine broadcasts from. So we are all, as we can see in the chat and in our hybrid event, we're coming from different places and time zones today. So both, like I just said, in person and virtually. Jack Pine Press is located on Treaty 6 territory, the unceded territories of the Nihiluk, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Dene nations, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I am currently turning in from Treaty 4. We welcome audience engagement throughout the launch. For my virtual audience, say hi in the chat by sending your message to everyone. And we welcome questions in the chat throughout the event. Live audience engagement, John will be sort of facilitating that, as I am currently probably this very large head on the TV. So live audio caption or live text captions, excuse me, are available through Zoom. You can turn them on or back off by pressing the live transcription icon at the bottom of the screen. So live audience, welcome. I'm a floating head, so this might be a little bit of an odd way to meet you all, but I'm happy that you're here. As I said a moment ago, John will be more of the host for the live audience than I will be. And so we're all going to embrace the hybrid nature of this. So just a housekeeping thing for our question period later tonight, it'll be split up into two parts. So Zoom audience will get a chunk of time to ask questions, and then we're going to open it up to the live audience where John will facilitate that and repeat the questions as they're asked so that the Zoom audience can also hear the question and then, of course, John's answer. So without me talking even more, I'm so delighted to introduce our author tonight. John Nyman is a poet, critic, and book artist from Toronto. In his work as a visual poet and erasurist, John seeks to intervene in the form and legibility of printed text in order to interrogate understandings of agency, authority, and the experience of reading. Alongside his more experimental work, John's publications include the full-length verse poetry collection Players, as well as forthcoming book of poems about the devil. John also holds a PhD in theory and criticism from Western University, reviews books for magazines such as Broken Pencil and Carousel, co-edits the online visual arts journal Peripheral Review, and helps administer the Plum Art Gallery in Midtown Toronto, where he's launching Your Very Own in person tonight. Welcome, John.
Oh my, thanks so much, everybody. Thanks so much, everyone who's here. Thanks so much, everyone who's tuning in virtually. I can't explain how bizarre it is to sort of have these two audiences, and I kind of don't know who I am as a person right now or who I'm looking at or talking to. Sometimes I might disappear from the frame to take a drink of iced tea. That's just how it's going to be tonight, because we live in a really weird world, right? Okay, but but I mean, I guess I'll get into it. There are a few people I wanted to thank to start off. First, I wanted to thank all of you for tuning in. And I especially wanted to say a quick word to the folks tuning in online. I've been to quite a few online kind of poetry launch and reading events. And I know that whenever I tune into something online, usually what I do is just kind of turn my camera off and put it on in the background and go do some dishes or something like that. So I just want to say that, if you're at home tuning in online, I really hope you engage with this in whatever way makes the most sense for you, right? I'm not going to expect, everyone's full attention, everybody to be staring at the camera if that's not really your jam tonight. So I do hope you enjoy it whichever way you're engaging with it. I also want to thank the Plum, of course, my colleagues here at the Plum Collective, and especially Emma, who's been kind of guiding a lot of folks in tonight. I also want to acknowledge that we here at the Plum, we're in Toronto, and this is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Huron-Wendat and other people who are indigenous to this land as well. For those who are here, we also have a great show on right now called Libations for Liberated Living, which was done in association with Design TO. And I love that this art show is up in the space because I think there's a commonality between the kind of works here and the sort of work that I did in Your Very Own, in that, Your Very Own is kind of like a book made out of another book. And here at the gallery, we have all kinds of artworks that are made out of other kinds of objects. And even for those of you tuning in at home, we have really excellent documentation of this show, as we do all our other Plum shows on our website, which I believe is theplum.ca. Hopefully I'm getting that exactly right, so you can follow the link. So you can check that out too if you're interested in what the live audience is going to see tonight. Of course, I also have to thank Jack Pine Press, right? I really give them exceptional thanks for working with me to put this book together. I think it really is quite a special book. I have a copy of it here I can show everybody, and there's also one out here in the audience at Plum. And I especially want to thank Amy for really putting so much effort into crafting this book when it came to things like the quality of the paper, the cover, and particularly some of the cutouts that are on the inside of the book, which are really, really special edition that I really think help bring the process behind this book kind of up to the surface and help it pop. So thank you, Amy, so much for that. I actually just got my hands on some of these books the other day, and they really wowed me. Even what I've seen in pictures is nothing like the physical thing, even in terms of how closely it relates to the classic Choose Your Own Adventure books that I grew up with and that I used as an inspiration for this. I also want to thank some of the folks who helped me look at earlier drafts of this book, and actually many of those people are in the room today. We have people like Hiba Abdallah, Miles Forrester, William Hunt, also my partner Amanda Boulos, who isn't here tonight, but I hope is tuning in online. And maybe I missed someone too. I'm not sure if there were other folks I've sent drafts to, but every work like this is an effort of many people working together to provide their feedback and their thinking and to put that into the collection. I guess I also want to address kind of what I'm doing here tonight. You've probably seen poetry launches where the poet will come up and say a few poems, but I don't really want to do that with this book because if you've seen any parts of it, I would kind of describe it as a bit of a quiet book. It doesn't really have that much to say. There aren't actually that many words in here. And if I went through and read them all to you, then I'd probably get through the whole book in about like 10 minutes or something, right? And I was hoping to leave a little bit more mystery than that to the actual content here. So what I'm going to do instead is something like an artist talk or a critical talk. And, a lot of you know, maybe also from the bio that you heard, that I have a background studying theory and criticism. And in a lot of ways, I've always kind of thought I'm more of a theorist posing as an artist than an actual artist or writer. So I figured with tonight, I'd kind of just cut to the chase and get to the theory and the criticism behind it. So that's what we're going to do. And I think with that kind of stuff out of the way, it's probably a good chance for us to start up the slideshow. I can get into the talk. Awesome. So I have roughly two major parts to the talk that I'm giving tonight. And in the first part, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background to my work in Your Very Own as it relates to appropriation, erasure, and these things that I like to think of as kind of dirty texts. So to introduce that idea, I have here an image on the screen of a pretty famous work of literature that you've probably heard of before. Of course, it's The Catcher in the Rye by Richard Prince, right? But you're probably thinking, well, The Catcher in the Rye wasn't written by Richard Prince. It was written by J.D. Salinger. So what's this thing, right? So I think this is kind of an interesting art object that was created. Basically, what we have here is a work of appropriation art where Prince made, as exact as he could, a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, except that he put his name on it. If we could advance the next slide. Cover of this book, Your Very Own, then you probably realize some of the connections between these works, right? Because you can see how I've taken my source text here, which is this Choose Your Own Adventure book, and basically adapted that into the kind of book that I've created. Anyway, so we go to the next slide again. There is a lot that I like about Prince's work of appropriation art. Now, one of the reasons I like it is it really calls into question on a fundamental level what a book really is, and particularly who's responsible for making a book what it is. So when we see Prince's name on the cover of The Catcher in the Rye, it reminds us that the author isn't the only person who determines how a book manifests in the world. And sometimes they're not even really the most important person. And we can think about how people like editors, translators, book designers, cover artists, publishers, printers, and even more kinds of people have made definitive contributions to some of the most important and well-known books of historical literature. Now, of course, if we keep connecting the dots here, we can also extend this question of who's responsible for a book's impact to something that's always been explored by the classic Choose Your Own Adventure children's books. I mean, these books have been asking us to think about that question for decades, right? Because they've always foregrounded this idea that it's not really the author making the story, it's the person reading it who's creating the story. And specifically you, it uses the second person all the time. And, the books literally even tell you, quote, you are responsible because you choose, right? They're saying that you made this book, you made this narrative what it is. So, we can look at a work of appropriation art like Richard Prince's book, and we can ask a question like, who's responsible for creating this, right? Who's kind of the authority behind it? But there's another aspect to appropriation art and this question of responsibility, which is a kind of different sense of responsibility that I would call like an ethical responsibility. And by ethical here, I really just mean questions of right and wrong. Okay, so, in that sense, we can ask something like, well, did Richard Prince act responsibly when he made a copy of J.D. Salinger's book? Was it acceptable or was it unacceptable for him to do that? But we can keep this kind of question of ethical responsibility rolling, right? We can ask whether J.D. Salinger himself acted responsibly when he wrote The Catcher in the Rye. And, this might not be a big deal today, but, for decades after this book was published, it was a frequent target of censorship by American moralists, right? So these were people who actually thought it was ethically wrong for him to have written this and to have distributed it to an audience. And we can even extend this further back to our beloved Choose Your Own Adventure books and the act of reading, right? We can say, if you were a kid reading these books, did you make responsible reading decisions? And I think that might be especially pertinent, if you were one of those people who always ended up getting to the endings of those books where your character just straight up dies, right? Did you make the right choices in crafting that story? So we can go to the next slide now, I think. Yeah, so, it's this question of ethical responsibility. That's what really brings me to this idea of dirty texts, which I mentioned at the beginning. So to me, when I think of a dirty text, this is a text that has something kind of unseemly or improper about it. But that sense of impropriety, it can come from a lot of different places, right? So, it might be that the writing in the book itself is like malicious or insensitive or oppressive or something like that. But there are other ways it could be dirty too, right? It might be that the text is associated with a person who is famously malicious or insensitive, even if that malice isn't in the text itself. It might even be that reading the text feels malicious or insensitive. And the kind of example that comes to mind for me here is like when you find really bad fan fiction online and you just sit around with people kind of making fun of it. You know, it's like someone put an earnest effort into that, but you're just treating it like it's worthless. You know, and even going further, it might be that the text was produced or distributed in a malicious or insensitive way. Like if you go to LibGen and pirate a PDF of the book you don't want to pay for, right? And that's probably the kind of feeling, that might be the kind of feeling you got when you saw Richard Prince's The Catcher in the Rye, right? It's kind of like, oh, this feels sort of wrong. It's not supposed to have that name in it. Yeah, so with this idea of dirty text, right? I think what I find interesting here is that a lot of us have been ethically trained to reject things that have this kind of dirtiness attached to them, right? And yet artists like Prince put us face to face with the question of what exactly we're rejecting and why are we rejecting that? So for a lot of appropriation artists, and here we can also bring in the group of conceptual poets, and if you're familiar with that movement, they basically brought a kind of appropriation art mentality into, you know, contemporary avant-garde literature. You know, so for the conceptual poets, for a lot of appropriation artists, when they create dirty texts, that's part of challenging a capitalist regime of copyright and intellectual property, right? And we can remember here that, you know, if you think of a word like, you know, improper, then that's also connected to this idea of property and ownership. And to create something improper can be a way of challenging that sort of regime of ownership. On the other hand, though, also if you know a lot about the recent history of conceptual poets or about Richard Prince, you might also know that they've become embroiled in different kinds of ethical scandals of their own, right? And in a lot of directions, these artists have been criticized not necessarily from, you know, defenders of intellectual property, but by the progressive left. And there are lots of longer stories behind this, but effectively we have artists who have been accused of integrating their appropriation art practices into existing institutional forms of classist and racist exploitation, right? So their texts then become ethical in a whole, or unethical rather, in a whole other way. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. I'm gonna take a drink. So, you know, one of my interests is in erasure poetry. And I think that over the last, you know, maybe 10 or 20 years, many of these kinds of questions about appropriation and literature and dirty texts have actually been handled, you know, with a lot of nuance by artists working in the genre of erasure. And this is also the genre that the book I'm launching today, Your Very Own, probably most belongs to, right? So erasure poetry has become a lot more popular since I was first exposed to it, which was maybe, you know, about 10, 15 years ago. So you might be familiar with it already. But if you're not familiar with the idea of the genre of erasure, you know, it usually refers to a technique where you have an author or an erasurist, and they'll create a text by taking a pre-existing text and then selectively removing words and other other textual components from that text. And you can see an example of it in the slide here, right? I've applied that erasure poetry technique pretty literally in my chapbook. And you can see that in comparison, right? So the bottom image is my book, and the top image is from the original Choose Your Own Adventure book, and it's the exact same image and text spread that I adapted into the page shown here. Yeah, and just to note my source text here in particular, it's a Choose Your Own Adventure book called Grand Canyon Odyssey, and it was written by Jay Leibold and illustrated by Don. And basically, everything that I've put into Your Very Own is composed in this fashion, with facing pages of erased images and erased text. So we get the next slide. So I actually wrote my PhD thesis in part about erasure writing. And from that experience, I would suggest that erasurists have pretty much always worked with dirty texts to some degree. However, the form of that dirtiness has been different in different time periods and in different erasurists' works. So, you know, especially if we look back before the 21st century and works in that kind of time period, a lot of the better known erasurists from a few decades ago, they tended to use the strategy of taking really canonical texts And I'm talking really canonical texts here, like, you know, Shakespeare and Milton level stuff. And they would take these books that were kind of eminently and even exaggeratedly proper, and then the way they manipulated them to create erasures was what created this impression of dirtiness or disrespect, right? Even though ultimately it was done in the name of artistic liberty, and that was part of the purposes behind the practice. However, if we look at more contemporary erasurists, especially if we look at BIPOC writers who are working in a socially progressive context, a lot of them have kind of flipped that interaction, right? So a good example here, if we go to the next slide, is the work of the NISGA writer, Jordan Abel. And his projects were also a major influence on me when I was writing Your Very Own. So in the book, in Abel's book titled Uninhabited, which you can see an excerpt from here, and also several subsequent projects that Abel has worked on, his source text is actually a big corpus of kind of early 1900s novels that were all written in this sort of frontier or like American Western kind of genre, right? Like lots of cowboys and stuff, you know, like saloons, that kind of stuff, right? So part of the point of Abel taking up these texts is that these are books whose whole culture and whole premise is based on a really deeply racist and colonial understanding of indigenous people in the Americas. So in other words, the corpus that Abel uses are already dirty books, right? And you know, in that sense, when Abel uses this corpus and incorporates it into his own work, part of his aim here is to kind of counter their gesture of appropriating land with his own gesture of appropriating text. So in a sense, you could say he's kind of fighting fire with fire in terms of the cultural intervention he makes in this corpus. But at the same time, part of his goal is also to show that fire for what it really is and what it's always been in terms of that colonialist impression of the Americas. And in that sense, his erasure is not only an act of mischief, but it's also an act of revelation and ultimately healing. So it takes that whole idea of dirtiness, the dirty text, and really takes it in a different direction. Okay, so we go to the next slide. Now, like Abel's erasures, my chapbook, Your Very Own, was composed in a spirit of investigation. Now, I have an author's note at the end of the chapbook, and in that note, I compare the book to a kind of archaeological excavation. But I also write in that note that, quote, I don't intend to quarantine myself from the dig site. Your Very Own is as much a disclosure of my own habits of thought and expression as it is a deconstruction of Leibold's, Heaton's, or anyone else's, maybe even your own, end quote. So I think, you know, in addition to that, I think you can also imagine me kind of like a private investigator from one of those old film noirs, right? So, you know, I might come in with this appearance that I'm going to be really neutral and objective, and I'm a crusader for the truth, right? But as the plot goes on, I can't help but get involved. You know, suddenly I realize I have accepted a favor from the local corrupt police officer, or I've fallen for the perpetrator's wife. The idea here is that, you know, that dirt, that dirtiness, it always spreads, and the dirt gets on you. And on a very abstract level, I think this is what Your Very Own is all about. So I'll take another sip here. I feel like I have to announce when I'm grabbing a drink, because of course everyone in the room can see me do that, but everyone online just sees me kind of disappear. Great. Yeah, so we can kind of move on to the second major part of my talk that I mentioned, which is where I'm going to talk on a more specific level about Your Very Own, and also a little bit about how I composed it. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so to begin with, you know, I should probably let you all know why I've associated this particular Choose Your Own Adventure book, again called Grand Canyon Odyssey, with this discussion of dirty texts that I've brought to the table here. Now, based on the initial response I've gotten to this chapbook, I would bet that a lot of you probably have a lot of a nostalgic attachment to the Choose Your Own Adventure books in general, and I definitely share that nostalgic attachment with you. But I also want you to know that at the very least, this particular Choose Your Own Adventure is definitely a little iffy, okay? And now the main reason for this is the protagonists. So the main character in this book, and remember, this is the character that the book's referring to as you and really encouraging the reader to identify with. That main character is a little blonde white boy, right? And I think we can kind of see a pattern here that we're familiar with, right? It reflects some of the deep-seated ideologies in Western culture about the so-called quote-unquote normal subject being white and male. And these kinds of ideologies, they are definitely prevalent when the book was published back in 1985. And of course, you can still find them in all kinds of places today as well. Now, in addition to that, the whole premise of Grand Canyon Odyssey is that you know, quote unquote, are going on a mission with your friend Delia, who's a Navajo girl. And her role in the book is basically that she knows all this stuff about river rafting and, you know, the natural history of the Grand Canyon and all this other stuff that your character has no idea about. And she's accompanying you on this journey, right? And I think this makes her a pretty clear example of another kind of stereotype that we're probably pretty familiar with. And this is the stereotype of the Indigenous friend or helper, right? Where they contribute all this knowledge and expertise, yet they're never given a leading or central role in the story. You know, and finally, I want to mention that this is a book from 1985, and it also uses the term Indian, which we understand is offensive in that context, right? And there's definitely a real, I think, tangible kind of gritty element of dirt that comes with reading something like that in the 2020s. Now, nevertheless, there is some ambiguity around this book's ethics, right? And around this question about how dirty or icky this old children's book from 1985 really is. Because I'd say there's also a fair bit in it that is fairly progressive, especially for its time. So, for example, the book does present a critique of at least a certain kind of colonialism, in that there is a conquistador character in the book, and that character is presented in an extremely negative light. He's basically the big villain of the story, right? And now, in addition to that, you know, although you could say the depictions of Indigenous people in the book are stereotypical or marginalized, but there is a fair variety of depictions of Indigenous people, as well as Indigenous culture and spirituality. And I'd say that all of these depictions in this particular book are either neutral or positive. Now, on the other hand, since this book was written, you know, to my knowledge, without consultation with any Indigenous people or groups, we could also say that the author's appropriation of Navajo culture and spirituality is unethical in a different kind of way. So again, you have these different layers of what ethics and responsibility and appropriation might mean in this context. You know, but overall, I think the point is that regardless of any merits that book might have, there are definitely problematic elements in it that we should be aware of when we read it in the 2020s. And that's what brings in this kind of dirtiness to it that I think makes it an interesting textual and even physical object, right, artifact. Okay, so now if we turn to my erasure of Grand Canyon Odyssey, what did I do with all those elements, you know, problematic or not? So I can talk about that a bit. You know, my book is divided into 3 distinct parts, and each of these parts is told from a different perspective. And these different perspectives or voices were adapted from the protagonists in the original book. So we could say that my characters are meant to be similar, but not exact recreations of the characters that J.B. Bald wrote in the original. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so the first part of the book is called Delia and I, and it's told from the perspective of, you know, at least in my imagination, of a white man who's basically in the process of ending a romantic relationship with an Indigenous woman named Delia. So what this means is that a lot of your very own is actually kind of breakup story, right? Now, this in itself is meaningful to me because I hope it might disrupt some of the basic ideology of the Choose Your Own Adventure series. Now, this series of books, you know, in the way that they focus on responsibility and agency, these books are basically meant to teach young people the value of independence and individualism, right? But, you know, in the real world, these kinds of values are constantly challenged by things like romantic and even our platonic entanglements. And we end up realizing that we can't rely solely on ourselves in order to be emotionally fulfilled. Now, beyond that kind of disruption of that ideology, your very own is also particularly concerned with mixed race relationships and mixed relationships in general. So, you know, I've never been in a relationship with an Indigenous indigenous woman, certainly not a Navajo woman. I have been in relationships with women of color, and I've tried to draw from some of those experiences while also incorporating some of the characteristics of Jay Liebold's original story and its depiction of Delia. So really trying to bring in things from my own experience, as well as kind of what's in this original book, seeing what kind of alchemy comes from that, right? Now, I think the narrator in this first section of the book is someone who is truly awed by Delia, and I think that he has some genuine appreciation for her as a person. But ultimately, what comes out is that his thoughts about her are infected by his latent racism and sexism. And, of course, this is also something that I've been trying for some time to explore in my own mind, right? Thinking about how these kinds of oppressive patterns of thought can still be prevalent, even if you're someone who should, consciously, quote unquote, know better, right? And also, especially thinking about how these patterns of thought can come out more strongly when we're thinking about things like romantic and sexual desire, which are often places where we might have fewer filters. It might turn off that sort of conscious part of ourselves that understands we're trying to be better and different people than the ideologies we've been raised with. So we can go to the next slide. So this is from the second part of the book, which is called You. And this part is narrated in the second person, just like the original Choose Your Own Adventure books. So the character depicted here it's the same little white boy from the original, who is the kind of the stand-in for the reader in the original Grand Canyon Odyssey. And this section, it's fairly distinct from the first section in terms of the story, in that this is kind of a separate story, and it's a sort of triumphant, very individualist story about growing up and really just learning about who you really are. Now, even when I say it in that tone, I think you can tell that my intention is for this story to be told a little bit sarcastically, right? And I've already talked about how there are some flaws in believing wholeheartedly in the kind of ideology that the Choose Your Own Adventure books present. Now, I don't think it's completely sarcastic, but I also think that one of the things that's brought to light by the illustrations in this book is how this kind of very standard, very Western story about self-actualization, it very often assumes a white male subject. And in many ways, it can be a very inflexible story when we try to apply it to situations where we actually have to acknowledge the diversity of individuals, as well as the complex histories of relationships between different groups. For example, indigenous people and settlers. Now, at the same time, I'd say that this little white boy's story is a little exaggerated, a little sarcastic, but it's also earnest in the sense that this is a story I can personally identify with, and it's a story that has genuinely given me strength and confidence throughout my life and growing up. When I was a little kid and I was reading these books, I was a little white boy, and I got to read these books about ostensibly me, and I was being represented as a little white boy, and those things clicked, and the messages and the ideology did resonate with me, and they still resonate with me, right? These are values that I still have. I wanted to point out too, you might be thinking I don't really look a whole lot now like this little white boy in the book, but I kind of wanted to reflect, like just a few weeks ago, I was actually showing this project to my mom, and one of her comments was like, "Oh, that little kid reminds me of you." So I thought that was kind of funny, right? And maybe it also speaks to the fact that, even if I don't really look like this character, part of this ideology I've been speaking of is the idea that I should look like this character, right? Or maybe that I already do, even if that's not objectively true. And I think that's interesting to think about as well, when we think about representation in this kind of book. Okay, so, more generally than that, kind of speaking beyond myself for a moment, I think that one of the things this second section of the book might do is present you with a kind of challenge to see whether you can identify with this narrative of self-actualization or not. And also, what does it mean if you can identify with it or not? Is this your narrative, or is this someone else's story that's being told? Does the you in the book actually refer to you, the reader? So I think these are questions that I think we can all ask ourselves to different degrees, insofar as we're familiar with this Western individualist story and have kind of lived with it. So we'll go to the next slide. So this second section of the book that I was talking about, it actually ends with a page that says the end, but it's actually not the end of the book, right? So I'd originally planned for this book to just have 2 sections, but one of the people I was able to share it with is a friend of mine named Joe Ianni. Some of you here might know him. He's another poet in the city. He actually read this and he kind of challenged me to try writing a section from Delia's perspective, to find a way to recenter her voice in this book. So I got really tied up about this idea, right? There were lots of different things to consider. You know, there are a lot of conversations happening in our contemporary culture about writers, and specifically white writers, trying to craft characters of other ethnicities. So part of me felt that I was either incapable of representing Delia, or that it would be actually unethical for me to try to do that. Now, on the other hand, I also realized that this case, it has some extra complications to it, right? Because with my version of Delia, I'm not so much trying to write a real Navajo person, or even a Navajo character from my own imagination. You know, in a sense, what I'm doing is rewriting some other white guy's idea of who a Navajo character would be. So I think there is an ongoing series of questions here about whether it's even possible for me to write an Indigenous female character with subjectivity and agency in the context of an erasure, which brings us back to the question of technique and process in this text. So I think there's a question of whether that's even possible, let alone whether it's ethical or permissible or whatever else you would attach to that. So, you know, I'm going to leave it up to everyone listening to answer those questions. But ultimately, I did take up my friend Joe's challenge, and that's what resulted in this 3rd section of the book. Now, this section is called Delia's Adventure, and it's written in the voice of that same Delia from the 1st section. And at this point in the book, she's kind of speaking back to her now ex-boyfriend about their relationship that's just ended. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so coming to the end here, right at the end of this 3rd section, we have this really intricate cutout of a conquistador, and I'm just going to show it on camera too to show how dynamic this is, because I really think, again, it's amazing the work that Amy and Jack Pine have done here. We have this cutout of the page and the author's note behind it. So in this author's note, which I mentioned earlier, you know, this is where I really speak directly from my own perspective and try to provide that window from the book itself to my role as author. So I think that what I've most tried to do with Your Very Own is to put myself into the story and to make myself culpable, despite the fact that this is a story I've adapted from someone else's writing. Now further, I've tried to offer an invitation for my reader to explore their own role in the experience of reading, whether that's the experience of reading this book, of reading, you know, Grand Canyon Odyssey, or reading some other dirty text that you might encounter in the world or even on your bookshelf. Now, throughout those experiences, I hope that we can come to understand responsibility. And here I'm talking about responsibility, whether that's, you know, Jay Leibold's responsibility for the book, my own responsibility for erasing it, bringing it back to your attention. It could be Richard Prince's responsibility in making his appropriation art project. And it could be your own responsibility in coming to this launch or tuning into this launch and maybe buying a copy of the book and reading it, right? But regardless of what responsibility we're talking about, I'm hoping we can understand it as something that's inherently multi-layered and complex, something that we need to dwell in without expecting quick or easy answers. Now, in the author's note, I put it this way, quote, "Erasure, whether it works to rectify error or bury truth, is a long and perhaps endless process. We can't expect to be done with it in a hurry, as if it were a flash of blinding light." And as I promised, that's all the reading I'm going to do from the book. So with that, you know, I hope you also approach this book in the spirit of excavation and self-reflection. And I'm going to wish you all happy journeys with the reading. Thanks for listening.
That was such a wonderful artist talk, John. Thank you so much. I'm sure all of us are sort of sitting with these questions as we go into the question period. So thank you again. it's so delightful to me when I get to hear authors or artists sort of thinking going into a project, because of course it involves so much thinking, and to hear a part of your journey with this book was really fascinating. So thank you for sharing all of that. So to begin our question period, we will start with the Zoom audience for let's say 7 to 10 minutes. And then we will shift over to the live audience. So to get us started, I will ask a question. And so while folks are sort of thinking about everything John has said, please, Zoom audience, pop your questions into the chat, and I will ask them to John, and we'll graciously soak up his answers. So to begin, I wanted to ask you about choice, as we ended on that in your talk. So you mentioned that the Choose Your Own Adventure books explicitly sort of tell the reader that they're responsible for what happens because of the choices that they make. And however, the author of, but I wanted to sort of ask you about, being the author of the book. So the author of the book is still fashioning the choices that readers are making, right? So how do we, I guess, in the spirit of erasure and thinking about choice and responsibility, contend with this? And how might this tension sort of relate to what you were thinking about with your very own, or what your very own is doing? Sorry, that was like a really long question.
No, it makes sense to me. I think it's a really good question. Yeah, and of course you bring in some important points, right? I think we all know what the Choose Your Own Adventure books are supposed to do in terms of choice. It's supposed to give you this idea that you've created the story, right? But obviously that's kind of just a big lie we tell kids in order to get them to read something fun, right? Because the stories are all there in the book already. There's a kind of decision tree that you can take. And really what's happened is that, as you've said, the author has made a lot of choices for you in terms of what you're going to experience in the story, how you're going to imagine it, the kinds of values and meanings you're going to get out of that, right? But the way I feel about something like choice, I wouldn't exactly say there's no free will, but I think there's certainly no free will the way that we're often taught to understand it, right? Because I feel that our experience of choice, it's actually really deeply related to the experience of compulsion and the kinds of structures of meanings that we're really locked into, not only in terms of reading, but in terms of our whole lives, right? But I think books and authorship are a great example of that, because there is really a powerful compulsive force that comes along with writing, in that when you read something, you basically have these thoughts kind of transmitted to you and put into your head, and you're kind of being beckoned to think about something a certain way, right? Mm-hmm. I guess what I would want to point out is that, in a sense, we can kind of laugh at the Choose Your Own Adventure books and say this is a sort of silly lesson or ideology of choice. It doesn't really work like this. But at the same time, I think they do teach us something about choice, in that it's really not about working independently in a free and open space, but about our relationships with people, right? It's about traction. It's about finding things that we can't directly change and navigating with them and working with them. And I also feel like the process of erasure really brings that out, right? Because the erasure technique in general, in part, it's about authors saying that I am not creating something from nothing. I'm not working with a blank space. But what's actually happening here, and what's happening in creation, is that I am constrained by what's already in the world, but I'm kind of finding my way through it. I'm seeking out a path. And I think that's something erasurists do. I also think that's something everyone does when they read a book, right? Because whenever you pick up a book, you do have a choice of what you're going to read first. Are you going to read front to back? You're going to read the table of contents? You're going to read the index? Are you going to turn to the back cover? And in a way, I think doing an erasure is like an acting out of that process of actually navigating a book, working with it on that material, tactile almost level of figuring out how to choose within the constraints that are offered to you. So I think I rambled a bit there, but I hope there was an answer to your question in there somewhere.
Oh, there's like so much richness in that answer. So thank you. I really love what you had to say about sort of carving out a space of in a place that, you know, isn't free of any hard choices, or like, now I'm totally butchering what you so eloquently said, but I really liked that idea of we're making our space maybe in a place that we need to actually do work to make that space. And I think that's really important because we are working in institutions and sort of canons and ideas about, you know, writing and things like that. So I think that's really a really fruitful answer that I'll be thinking about for the rest of the week, I'm sure. So we have a question in the chat. So someone asks, does the process of erasure erase the dirt of dirty or unethical texts? Or does the process of erasure highlight problems and start a conversation about ethics in texts?
Okay, well, I think that's a very well-worded question. I think so well-worded that I think the answer is kind of already there. Right? How could you give that whole second option and then say, like, no, that's not how it really is. Just wipe that away, clean that away. All we're doing is cleaning it up, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that the way that phrases it the way that it's really all about for me, right? In that this dirt is kind of here, and the idea isn't that we can just clean it up. You know, again, think back to the private investigator from the film Noir, right? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of stories are a lesson in this idea that, you know, if you go in with the intention of creating a blank slate, of just creating this kind of pure, pure ethics out of what exists in the world, you're going to run into trouble, right? Because, you know, you can't do anything. You can't exercise agency and choice without becoming mixed up in what the world kind of has to offer. So, you know, I'd see it almost more as a process of, you know, acknowledging what's here. There's certainly a process of illuminating things that may be less ethical, you know, less kind of benign than we might have thought they were, but we're not doing that in order to get rid of them and just say that we're going to bring in something better from outer space, right? I think it's a process of kind of remixing, reforming, and finding other ways to inhabit what's here.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And I love what you say about like remixing and reforming and finding other ways of being and doing. And I think that also sort of ties into what you've talked about in your talk, with particular with Abel's work of sort of like a kind of an action of reclamation and sort of I'm losing my train of thought after that, but I like this idea of there's this kind of reclamation happening, especially with erasure. I think that's really interesting. So thank you for that answer. So before we open up to the live audience, I have one more question from the Zoom chat. So someone asks, what was the most rewarding part of creating this chapbook?
That's a great question. I love that because, you know, even from the last answer, I was almost considering if I wanted to add that, you know, because as much as I can critique these values of individualism and independence, you know, they also mean something to me, right? And I think that's a great follow-up question because I sort of feel like the most rewarding part of this process for me was something that's a very much me thing to enjoy, if you're someone who knows what kind of person I am. Because to me, the best part of this was, you know, the process involved making scans of the original book, you know, putting them into Photoshop, correcting the you know, the white balance and the colors and stuff like that. And ultimately, it involved going into these, you know, high resolution digital files and very finely, intricately, you know, brushing over or deleting pixels in order to get rid of specific letters and specific words, and just getting really kind of every pixel of each of the pages of these books just right in terms of capturing the original, but also really cleanly and sharply erasing certain parts to give this kind of effect. And to me, that's extremely rewarding. You know, I'm just the kind of person who loves that kind of detail work. I love having a mission that's already in mind and just really kind of completing it. You know, it's kind of funny for me to say that as an artist and a creator. But as a writer, I've always sort of felt like I liked editing a lot more than writing. And when you do an erasure, it's all editing, right? So I just find it an extremely rewarding and satisfying process, just to sit there on my computer with, you know, an airbrush at like 1,000 times magnification, right? So that's it.
That's really, really cool. And I was thinking while you were talking about how I'm sure profs have said this to you too, but a piece of advice that I've gotten as a poet is like revision is where the real writing happens, which is particularly interesting with the work that you're doing. So, very cool. So let's open up the question period to live audience. So we welcome questions.
Yeah, hi folks. What's on your mind? Does anyone want to talk? Go ahead, Anne. Yeah, that's great. I'm guessing, was that audible on the Zoom call, or should I repeat it?
Please repeat it, John. There was only some snippets I could hear.
Sure, yeah, no problem.
Thank
so just
you.
to repeat the summary, you know, the question was that it's interesting that I chose the structure of a choose your own adventure book for the erasure, because I guess I'll reinterpret it a bit, but I'm not really doing a choose your own adventure the way the book kind of recommends, but I am sort of choosing my own path through the linguistic terrain that the book provides. And then the question was about whether I still felt kind of bound in a way to the choose your own adventure structure. Yeah, so I think that's one of the interesting things about erasures in general, right? And it also comes with the way I start to think about text and language and what you call that linguistic terrain when you're doing an erasure, right? Because on one hand, you can kind of break everything down to material and say, this is just a bunch of letters, it doesn't mean anything. Or even more than that, this is just a bunch of lines and curves, you know? And I've done erasure projects that took things down to the actual forms and shapes of letters, even more so than the letters themselves. But at the same time, I don't think you can really work with a source text without having a lot of understanding of where that text came from. You know, that text had its own sort of story of coming to you. You have your own reason for being interested in it, which probably has something to do with the original author's intentions and what that book originally was, right? So it's hard for me to really give a definite answer to that question, but it certainly was on my mind. You know, there are some pages where you know, I feel like I've retained little bits of that choose your own adventure structure, even though it's not as explicit as telling you, you know, turn to this page if you make this choice, turn to this page if you make this choice. But of course, there is that section that uses the second person, that uses you. And I did imagine that as a way of the book kind of reaching out to the reader and pulling them in a little bit, right? And replicating that aspect of the structure to it. But at the same time, there was also a little bit of tension, right? There's also a sense in which, you know, I wanted to kind of be different or push against the choose your own adventure structure, right? And to say like, you know, you're telling me that I have all this agency over this imaginative adventure story, but I don't believe in the kind of agency you're giving me. So I'm going to try to do a completely different kind of agency, right? Where I'm actually going to take away choice from the reader at some points just because I can make a new text out of this that does something so different. Yeah, so it was definitely on my mind, but it's also one of those things where I feel like I don't have a really definite answer to it, and it might manifest differently at each part of the book. So we have another question.
So I would like to hear a little bit about your experience also as an illustrator for this, and the role that like does negative space need to be characterized as well as you and Adelia. So what was having sort of like space is on the just sort of like going through like what inspired you to not include or to cut
question. So, just to summarize that, it was referring to my role as an illustrator in the book and the use of negative space in some parts of the book. And I assume you mean both in a visual sense, but also in the more kind of thematic character and plot sense. And also what inspired my decisions of which parts to cut. I think I could give a kind of crass answer, which is that I tried to cut things where the picture still looked nice after I cut them out. So there was an element of trying to find the hidden compositions within the original composition, right? And it's actually interesting because, if you've ever done an erasure of a text, you realize that it is very constraining, right? Because there tend to be only certain words or combinations of words on the page that are actually going to fit together in a way that really means anything or accomplishes what you want. I found that working with the illustrations was also very constraining, right? And you run into things you wouldn't expect. You might have a form or a figure that you'd like to have in a composition that you think is interesting, but just part of that figure is being overlapped by something else that's in the foreground. So you can't really use it anymore because when you do the erasure, you end up with this incomplete looking kind of thing, right? I guess it's funny, this kind of reflection is actually sort of leading me to an answer about this, right? Because I think part of the task was finding some of the negative space that was already there or that could be there and making it more visible, right? And I did think it was particularly interesting to do that with this book because of the style of illustration. A lot of these illustrations have a lot of figures and characters in them and a lot of distinct parts, which made it easier, I think, to remove certain parts and leave certain things behind. I think the other thing that really inspired it was trying to make the illustrations fit the perspective of each section, right? So when I did the section on you, I was really kind of trying to isolate that protagonist figure from the original book and kind of present him in the open space of a world which ends up being his oyster, right? A world which he can exercise his agency in. In the section on Delia and I was really thinking a lot about how the narrator there would have in part an objectifying gaze towards Delia, that would be connected to racist attitudes, colonialist attitudes, and also just, classic misogyny, right? And the difficulty of navigating that in heterosexual relationships. But I think the last section, Delia's adventure, was the most interesting in that regard, because there, I tried to find images in the book that depicted things like nature or spiritual space, the kinds of things that someone with more agency than the story set out in the original would be able to see in the original illustrations there. And in that sense, it was interesting to see what I would keep and what I could cut out to kind of open up that blankness. And again, I think that last page with the conquistador cutout is a really great example of that. I was originally just going to erase the conquistador character and have that image just be a kind of rock with literally nothing above it at all. But it ended up becoming the cutout of the conquistador, right? So that oppressive figure is both there and not there, which of course adds more layers to that kind of negative space. Thanks. We have another question here. Are we still good on time, Taya?
Yes, I think we'll wrap up after this last question, and then you can sort of, people can ask you questions after the lunch.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you folks in the audience here get to chat with me all night if you want to. But I have really enjoyed the time that I've spent here on the Zoom call as well. So Alvin, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a common thread about racial my question is, what do you think are the other directions that a racial motion take, either aesthetically or political outlook?
Yeah, and that last version of it is a really big question, right? So again, to repeat, the question was that erasure has this tendency to, illuminate flaws in an existing ideology or completely subvert that ideology. And the question, I think, is basically like, can erasure do other stuff, right? What else can erasure do, or what would I like to see it do? And the answer I want to give to this initially is like really a meta answer, right? Because, if we're going to propose this sort of new erasure or the next kind of erasure or another thing erasure can do, that's almost like an erasure of the previous erasure, right? It's yet another relationship of saying, I'm going to subvert this, or I'm going to find something different based on the material I've been given from this technique, right? And maybe one way to answer that is to say, I've always found erasure to be a kind of interesting genre, because it is very technically and formally constrained in what sort of looks like erasure, even though it very bleeds into all these other forms of visual poetry and, of course, also visual art, right? I mean, on a certain level, we're talking about putting form and color and texture on a flat surface and what that can really do. So maybe part of this answer is actually kind of a question of the unconscious and like forgetting, right? That there may be erasures, there probably already are erasures that are sort of forgetting what erasure has been or what erasure has done in the past. Because when we create, we are locked into those structures that come before. But part of being human is that we carry our whole history with us, but not always in the space of consciousness and intention in terms of what we're trying to create as artists. So, maybe the new directions of erasure are actually erasures that find a new way into the genre, or to find a new way to make work that looks similar, but by telling a completely different story of how we can get there as creators.
Wow, what a place to end for the Zoom audience by telling a completely different story. And I'm a person that has captions on, so it's always really interesting to see what the captions sort of collect from what you're saying. I think for what the answer you just gave, it was like coming from computers something. I'm like, I don't know that that's correct. Maybe I need to do some erasure on my captions.
Yeah, the captions, the AI, it's like another form of forgetting, right?
Totally.
Conscious.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. But thank you so much, John. This has been so amazing. And thank you to both of our audiences tonight. This hybrid event has gone so swimmingly that I'm almost like, is this a trick? Just kidding. It's been really great. And I hope everyone has fun at the Plum after we sign off on Zoom. And just so everyone knows, a recording of this launch will be available after the event on Jack Pine Press's YouTube channel to rewatch or share. And you can purchase your very own on Jack Pine's website. And those of you that have pre-ordered the book, those will be shipping out this week or early next week. Have a great evening. Bye.
Thanks so much, folks.